Hello, welcome to the Comic Book Commentary. I'm Bo Leidig, and this week we're once again getting back into our retrospective look at Spawn with Spawn number 41. So let's zoom in and take a closer look. First published in January of 1996, I am a huge fan of this cover for a few reasons. Reason number one, it's just a very well illustrated cover to this book. Greg Capullo really knocked it out of the park with this one. Obviously, Todd McFarlane on inks. Overall, it's just really cool looking, but more importantly than it just looking good, it's very much serving a purpose in that this cover is bridging the gap between the previous issue and this issue. We see the predicament that Spawn was put in at the end of issue number 40 and what he's going to be facing off against in this issue number 41, with him being in the clutches of the curse and being ripped apart by all these little weird cyber gremlin guys that the curse has working for him. I don't know if Curse created these guys or what they're called. Their origin is not really explained. He didn't have them the first time around that we saw Curse, and he didn't have them during his brief appearance in the Blood Feud miniseries, and now he just seems to have a whole bunch of them that are just at his beck and call, doing his bidding at all times, and there's no explanation for it. I mean, there may be at some point, but not in these two issues. Story, Todd McFarlane. Pencils, Greg Capullo. Inks, Todd McFarlane. Copy editor and letters, Tom Orzechowski. Color, Brian Haberlin, J.D. Smith, Dan Kemp. A special thanks to Danny Meeke. In the first page, we have a large bit of exposition right here from Todd McFarlane, explaining that the whole reason for the ongoing war between heaven and hell is that whichever side wins will be able to reign for all eternity. Reign over what exactly? It's not explained. Existence as a whole, possibly. The earth, maybe. Again, he doesn't really go into any super deep detail about any of that. And he also explains that the armies of both sides are fueled by the ranks of the souls of the undead, and that when a soul dies on Earth, that said soul is either recruited to hell to become a spawn or to heaven and become an angel. And it really, he's kind of creating a bit of a plot hole in this, at least in the way he's portrayed everything up until this point. Yes, the whole idea of the hellspawn makes sense, but there's also hellborn, like the demons. So we know that there are creatures that exist and their origin is in hell. But then we have to question, how does it work for heaven then? Are there natural born heaven creatures? Are there, is there an equivalent to a demon? Because in typical Judeo-Christian stories and beliefs, demons and angels would be the polar opposite equivalents of each other. So if angels are all the souls of the dead from Earth who have been recruited to fight in this holy war, then what would heaven's demon equivalent be in this case? Also, this doesn't really explain how Earth came to be because, again, in typical Judeo-Christian belief systems, heaven or God created all of Earth and all of the creatures on it. So if Earth had been created by God and then now there's this battle for all eternity, but all of the soldiers who are going to fight in this war are coming all from the same place that would have been created by God. See how the logic kind of just doesn't make sense when you try to use it in this manner? I understand Todd's just using Christianity as a backdrop for his story, and he's not just going deep diving into actual, Bible theory and that kind of stuff. So I'm not holding him to it. I'm just saying that it doesn't really seem to track what he's doing so far. And again, maybe he gets to the point where It does all make sense, and he does kind of wrap it all up with a neat little bow. But at this point, it seems awful confusing the way he's trying to portray it. We see Spawn here in a bit of a agonizing looking position, as it's stated that this is actually a test that he's going through to prove that he is worthy of being one of the generals of hell in the upcoming holy war between heaven and hell, and that in order to pass this test, he only has to do one thing, which is survive. We then get a big 2-page vertical splash. Come on, Greg, how are you going to do me like that, man? Where we see the curse continuing to dissect Spawn and taunt him as he does so, saying, now you know what it feels like to be helpless and bound with your limbs being taken off, the way that I was in your alleyway and the way that I was in that bell tower with Cy-Gor. These, of course, referring to the last 2 times we saw the curse, and the pretty remarkable predicaments he was in after being defeated by Spawn and then being kidnapped by Cy-Gor at the beginning of the Blood Feud miniseries. Now, while I don't really like having to deal with 2-page vertical splashes, not because I think they look bad, but because I'm not really set up to film them in my current setup right here, I gotta admit, this does look super cool. This is a fantastic page or set of pages that Greg has drawn here. And, for as much trouble as it is for me to have to, deal with not being able to turn this in the quote unquote correct orientation, it still looks fantastic. Curse then goes on to say that he actually revels in the amount of pain he is causing Spawn right now, and that his ultimate goal here is to complete the dissection of Spawn and then dismember him and mail all these parts off to different scientific teams that he has waiting in multiple locations. He doesn't really say where, because he believes that the necroplasm that Spawn's body is actually made up of is comprised entirely of sin, and that with enough study and research, he can actually find out what the origin of sin is through this necroplasm, which will inevitably give him power over Satan. He is still bitter about the fact that he believes God betrayed him in his time of need, even though he feels that he's dedicated his entire life to trying to serve the Lord. Keep in mind that the curse is quite mad and seems to be entirely out of touch with reality, as he has amputated parts of his own body in what he believes is subservience to God and what God wanted of him, even though he doesn't really explain how he came to that conclusion. He also believes that once he does this, that he will ultimately be able to defeat Satan in some way, but he doesn't state that this is because he believes it's going to get him back into God's good graces. It just seems to be more of a personal vendetta at this point. However, there are a bunch of loose ends that he needs to wrap up to make sure that all of the shipments of Spawn's many body parts get to where they're supposed to go. So he decides to leave Spawn alone in this laboratory as all of his creepy little goblin cyber guys follow him along. Because why on earth would you leave anyone behind to make sure that Spawn, doesn't get up to trying to escape in any way? I mean, I get the whole idea that, Curse has a few screws loose, and he believes that he is 100% in control of this situation and doesn't actually have to, watch Spawn at all times to make sure that he stays put. But again, maybe leaving like one of these dudes behind would have been a smart idea, but no, of course, in typical evil supervillain fashion, he walks off to attend to something else, leaving the hero behind to potentially free himself and fight back. After Curse leaves, Spawn starts to remember another instance in his past which was very similar to this, as we are treated to a flashback. He remembers a mission that he was on as Al Simmons very early in his military career, where he was in the jungles of Southeast Asia, as we see him notice a head on a stake, and then we notice that he's surrounded by many heads on stakes. Now this actually makes young Al Simmons, who at the time of this mission was only 21, rather upset, not because of the heads on the stakes, but because this doesn't bother him to see anymore, which he realizes at such a young age it should, and he's starting to wonder, what effects his career path has had on him at this point already, where seeing dismembered body parts all over the place isn't something that bothers him anymore. He and his fellow soldier Tim are then ambushed by an enemy soldier who manages to get the jump on them and tie them both up to stakes in the ground. The soldier then begins to question them, trying to get information about what their mission is, and Al and Tim refuse to talk. So the soldier decides to start dismembering Tim in an attempt to get Al to speak. However, Tim holds fast and is constantly pleading with Al to not talk and that he'd rather die than give up the rest of their unit on their mission. Al refuses to speak, and 10 hours later, Tim is in multiple pieces and no longer breathing. The soldier then moves on to Al and sticks a dagger up his nose as he threatens to do the same to him, and Al recollects that this was the first time in his life that he actually truly just wanted to murder someone out of pure vitriol, that it wasn't just something that was in the line of duty or, him fighting an enemy combatant, that he genuinely hated this man and he wanted to murder him for what he had done. However, before the enemy soldier can do anything to Al, he is shot through the head by another soldier whose name is Sagan. And Sagan then rescues Al, and the two of them become expert killers as they continue through the jungle, trying to make their way back to their own unit and then further on in their careers. We're then teleported back to New York City as Jason Wynn is exiting the hospital after being released from the recovery of all of the injuries that he sustained when Spawn made his assault on the CIA headquarters. One of his subordinates tells him that a lot of the higher-ups at the Bureau and the Pentagon are wanting to question him, and that their original instructions were to bring Wynn directly in for said questioning so that they could tie up some loose ends. Wynn basically says to hell with that and orders his subordinate to take him directly home. His subordinate obviously agrees with this and gets Mr. Wynn into the back of the limo and starts taking him back to his apartment. Wynn believes at this point that he has strung a decent enough web of lies to cover his tracks about the entire incident with Spawn at the headquarters. Unfortunately, while he's not super concerned about where his standings lie with the US government, he is very concerned about where his international standings are with the secret cartel that he is part of, which is one of the biggest sources of his wealth and power. As he enters his apartment, he is greeted by none other than the Violator, sitting around on his couch, eating a bunch of his food, wearing his robe, and smoking one of his cigars. This, of course, does not play well with Jason Wynn, as he immediately pulls out a pistol and points it at the Violator's head, stating, "How did you get in here?" And the Violator states, "Yeah, by now you should know that I do things. Deal with it." He then explains that one of the things he's done is help to get Wynn out of hot water and keep him on the streets, and that Wynn should be more appreciative. Wynn states he's not impressed, but the Violator counters by stating, "Oh, you are absolutely impressed, because if you weren't, you would have already tried to kill me." He then tells Wynn that he's actually rather disappointed in him, that he's not living up to his end of the bargains, and that, Violator has gone out of his way to leave a bunch of loose ends for the people investigating Jason Wynn to find that keep him off of his trail and keep him credible in his standing with the government and the cartel and keep him in the position that he's in. And that Wynn's part of the bargain in terms of making the world a living nightmare for Terry Fitzgerald, Wanda Blake, and Granny Blake is something that he hasn't been keeping up with at all. And this is something that the Violator is rather upset about, because this is the way he plans on dealing with Spawn, and he needs Wynn to do it. He then tells Wynn that from now on he wants him to redouble his efforts and go hard on Fitzgerald and both of the Blake women and make their lives incredibly uncomfortable so that he can keep making Spawn more and more agitated. Wynn states he's going to do it, and Violator responds with, "Yeah, you better." We're then teleported to somewhere in the woods. We don't know where at all. However, we are once again reunited with Cy-Gor, who has been traveling south for 5 days at this point, trying to keep as low a profile as possible for an 8-foot-tall cyborg gorilla, as we don't know exactly where he's trying to travel to, but he seems to just be on a path and doing his best to avoid human contact. However, his travels have taken him directly to some dive bar in the middle of nowhere, and in the parking lot, a young couple are having a bit of an argument. The man, who appears to be quite drunk, is trying to convince his girlfriend to sleep with him in the back seat of his car. She, of course, protests, stating, "You're drunk, your breath stinks, this is stupid, let's just go inside and have some drinks with our friends." And unfortunately, this situation is misunderstood entirely by Cy-Gor, who believes that the woman is in dire trouble. He then responds by ripping the roof of the car clean off, which of course horrifies the two people inside, as they of course were not expecting a giant cyborg gorilla to just suddenly attack their car. The man responds by pulling a large knife out of his boot and stabbing Cy-Gor with it, as we are once again treated to the whole narrative that Cy-Gor's existence is because of the fact that human beings can't withstand the pain of having cybernetic implants bonded with their body. However, that flies in the face of all the cyborgs that exist in the Image universe at this point, including, the entirety of Cyberforce, Cyberdata, Super Patriot, Overt Kill. I don't know why Todd went with this storyline, because it really just is a massive, massive plot hole if you take it into the context of the rest of the Image universe, or even just other characters who exist in Spawn. Hell, go back to Spawn number 11, where the two cyber gangs were fighting each other. Every person on both sides of those gangs had cybernetic implants, and they all seemed A-okay. None of them seemed to be in horrific pain at all times. But for some reason, Cy-Gor had to exist for this very inconvenient reason. I don't know. He really should have thought this out better. This is one of the very big complaints I have about Cy-Gor and his origins. We then see that Cy-Gor falls down to his knee as he's still clutching the man, and tons of patrons from inside of the bar rush out to the parking lot to see what the commotion is. Cy-Gor then takes this moment to make a steady retreat as he just smashes his way through all the cars in the parking lot, sending them flying, and retreats back into the wilderness. Now, this is also kind of a problem when you consider the fact that, again, part of the explanation for Cy-Gor's backstory is that he was being engineered as part of a very secretive government project where they wanted to create cybernetic super soldiers out of animals and then give them human intelligence inserted into their own brains to a something like 90-10 split, 90% human, 10% simian, so that they could deal with the pain, but also have all of the intelligence that a human soldier would need in battle. However, when they reached the point of it being 50-50 is when the entire experiment went wrong, and that led to the current version of Cy-Gor we see here before us. But if he's supposed to be some kind of super cybernetic soldier, why is it that he's brought down by literally a single drunken hillbilly with a knife? This doesn't make any sense. I mean, I get it. He's not, down for the count or anything, but one knife wound shouldn't be all it takes to just stagger this monstrous killing machine of war, at least not in my opinion. We're then teleported to a small cabin somewhere with 3 men who are experienced trackers and hunters who take jobs for the US government, as they've been charged with finding Cy-Gor and relaying his location back to their employers, who are the government agencies that funded the development of the Cy-Gor program, as they want their asset back. The men are kind of arguing with each other a bit, as one of them is loading up a gun, but the other one states, what are you doing? We're not supposed to harm him in any way. We're just supposed to detain him if possible, and make sure that we call in all of these government spooks to come and find him and capture him. He then points to the map and states, "My only concern is that hopefully he's smart enough to not go directly into this town." However, at the bottom of the page, it says that he's not, meaning that Cy-Gor is headed directly into civilization for the first time, where things are most likely not going to go well for him. Meanwhile, back in Curse's lab, we see that Spawn is diligently working to try and pull a nearby operating instrument table towards him via some sort of cable that's wrapped around the leg of it that also seemed to be within his grasp. As I stated, they probably should have left at least one person in the room with him to make sure he didn't try this sort of thing. As he works diligently for roughly 20 minutes, he manages to get the cart close enough to him that he can pull one of the knives off of it. He then uses said knife to cut his remaining hand off, which then falls to the floor. However, he's able to control it like Thing from the Addams Family and uses this hand to try and free his costume, the CLXXV. He launches the hand into it multiple times, trying to break the glass. However, he is disheartened when he realizes that he's become too weak via the drugs that have been injected into him by the curse, and he starts to believe that his one and only hope of freeing himself is now gone, as the hand falls limp on the ground and the costume is still contained within the giant glass tube filled with liquid. It's at this moment that Curse returns along with all of his cyber goblins in tow, continuing to gloat, stating that he's made all of the final preparations for all of the shipments of Spawn's body parts, and is now ready to perform the final part of the dissection, which is the removal of Spawn's brain. He believes that by studying Spawn's brain and his subconscious, he will finally find the true root of all evil and sin, and that this is his moment of triumph. And after attaining this knowledge, he'll finally be able to finish up all of his life's work and justify all of the sacrifice and heartache and just complete devotion to this one singular task. And as he does all this, he makes sure to let Spawn know that he plans on making this as painful as possible for him, when he suddenly notices that Spawn has in fact cut off his other hand. He laughs, believing inaccurately that this was some sort of attempt for Spawn to remove his arm from his restraints, but he tells Spawn that the way they're designed, there's nothing he could have done to get out of them. Even removing his hand would not have allowed him to free himself from these restraints the way that they're set to immediately grapple onto him if they believe at any way, or sense, I should say, in any way, that he's trying to escape. However, we notice during all of this exchange that the tube which contains Spawn's costume, the CLXXV, has started to crack as a result of the assault made on it by Spawn's hand. As we see Spawn's body parts being loaded up into various boxes, Curse goes on to actually commend Spawn, stating, "Trust me, I know how difficult it is to perform a self-amputation. You may even have noticed that I've removed my other arm since we last saw each other." We then also see that the costume is continuing to seep through the crack in the glass and doing its best to try and break the tube open by spreading that crack wider and wider. We're also very much given a new revelation in the idea that Curse has amputated his second arm. There's no explanation given to why he did this, but up until this point, it would have been completely reasonable to assume that this was the result of the torture that he suffered at the hands of Sansker during the Blood Feud miniseries, when in actuality, that wasn't the case at all. Curse just decided to cut his other arm off for reasons unknown. However, it's at this point that Curse's ramblings and gloating are cut off when the CLXXV bursts out of its containment and immediately starts to wildly rip into everything around it, tearing the little cyber goblins apart and vigorously doing its best to grab hold of all of Spawn's removed body parts and necroplasm as it tries to absorb all of it back into itself and reassemble him. Curse immediately jumps into action, opening fire on the costume, however, to no avail, as the costume grabs the large chunk of Spawn's body, torso, and head, and immediately throws it down its quote-unquote mouth, I guess you would call it, as it does its best to reassemble its host, while also ripping Curse in half at the waist in a sea of blood and gore. As daylight breaks, we see that the costume has somewhat managed to put Spawn back together. However, he is not 100%, as even the book describes him as moving like a satanic Raggedy Andy. Spawn's legs buckle under his weight, and his body is doing its best to try and respond to its inputs. However, it's not 100% back together at this point as Spawn moves towards the window to try and make his escape. However, Curse still remains quite confident as he tells Spawn not to gloat that this isn't over, and Spawn turns around stating absolutely it is. However, Curse, not to be outdone, drags what's left of the upper half of his torso, leaving a bloody trail of his entrails behind him, and grabs one of the heads of his little cyber goblins, which seems to have a countdown going inside of its mouth. At this point, it shows that apparently Curse had all of these little cyber goblins implanted with some kind of self-destruct device in their heads, and we see the counter slowly counting down to 0 just as Spawn is making his escape, and things are not boding well for Spawn or Curse in this moment. Also, what the hell, Greg? I mean, I get it that this is kind of like cool looking, but come on, Frankenstein's castle on the top of whatever sort of like geological structure this is, the impossibility of this castle existing on top of this rock outcropping is immeasurable. How would you ever get the materials up here to build it? What exactly is the path that you take to get to this place? Where on earth is this supposed to even be? So many unanswered questions. I get it. It is kind of cool looking on the backdrop of the moon, but once you get past that, none of this makes sense, even a little. We then see Curse's castle explode into a gigantic fireball with no trace of Curse or Spawn, as we're left to wonder exactly what happened to the both of them, as this is the final page of the issue, and the next issue is going to be called The Aftermath. We then get to Image Info, just the standard run-of-the-mill stuff here, talkings about what was going on with Image Comics, and upcoming books that were going to be coming out in the future of the year 1996. We then reach the spawning ground, the letter column, in which readers may have their letters published and responded to directly by Todd McFarlane. There were a few things that stuck out in this month's issue. Number one was that a lot of people seem to have real complaints about issue number 37, which was the first appearance of the Freak, as it's confusing as to exactly how this even fits into the storyline, which Todd does explain that I guess that issue was actually supposed to come out earlier than it did, but because of some conflicts with publishing and printing, it came out later than it was supposed to, which is why it doesn't seem to really fit into the story super well. And also the complaints that echoed my own, those being that Todd is just way too trusting of the Freak through the entire issue. There was literally no reason whatsoever for him to just blindly follow the Freak on his quest for vengeance and not even do the most basic amount of inquiry to find out if Freak's claims were even remotely true or accurate. He just follows him along and helps him commit a bunch of murder. And it does make Spawn seem like kind of a moron throughout the entire thing. And again, these are a lot of the same criticisms I had, and I can't agree more with them. That part of it doesn't really make sense, and it would have made a lot more sense to draw out the story of the Freak for a longer period of time, showing him slowly gaining the trust of Spawn over a period of months, which would have then led to the idea of Spawn helping him on that mission, making a lot more sense. And the other thing that stuck out to me was that there was one guy who wrote in from Hong Kong. I say guy, he was a kid who was at the age of 14. And he was informing Todd that Spawn, along with many other comics in Hong Kong, had been deemed to be inappropriate for children and were now under the jurisdiction of the government, in the sense that you had to be at least 18 to buy them. And he wanted to bring this to Todd's attention as, showing him that, censorship in other countries is a real thing that he may not be considering because he operates out of America. And that also he was questioning if he thought that his comic book was in fact not appropriate for kids under the age of 18. Todd responded by stating that he didn't believe that his comic was too over the top for teenage kids, but he also doesn't believe that his comic book was appropriate for young children either, which completely flies in the face of some of the stuff he had said in earlier Spawning Grounds, where he talked about the fact that, him and his wife let his daughter basically consume whatever type of media she wanted as long as they sat down and talked with her about it, and that he believed that it was wrong to try and keep kids from seeing or consuming certain things that were just deemed too inappropriate for them. But now he's like, oh no, Spawn's probably a little much for a kid who's under the age of 7. It's like, yeah, no kidding, Todd. And that was kind of my point in my criticism of his responses in those earlier issues, is that, he didn't really seem to me like he meant what he said, in the sense that, yeah, it's easy to say like, oh, we'll let our daughter watch anything, but then not consider what the word anything truly means. And I'm pretty certain that him and his wife would have had some real hard and fast limits depending on how graphic or sexual or violent the media that their daughter may have been trying to watch, who I think at the time was only like 5, could have been. And I thought that Todd was being a bit disingenuous in the way that he portrayed himself and his wife in that previous issue. And now it seems even more disingenuous reading about the way he's responding to this letter in this issue. We then get a 2-page pinup of Spawn battling the Tremor, and I really like this pinup. I think it's super cool. It's by a duo who are named J.D. Smith and Jorn Stye, I think is what it is. It's kind of hard to read as they wrote their name in a rather stylized font, which is one of the reasons I do wish that Todd actually printed in typeface who the artists of these pinups were, so that I can actually give credit where credit's due and not have to guess about their names. Unfortunately, he didn't do that, and sometimes I can't always read exactly how their names are spelled, or I don't know how they're pronounced, or sometimes I just can't even find the signature depending on the way that they drew it into the actual picture. And I get that they were going for a stylized look, which is fine. I don't have a problem with that, but I'd also like to have a very, bold-faced type. This is who drew this piece of artwork. This is who you need to be crediting it for. We then reach the end cap section where they go on to talk about the upcoming McFarlane toy line that is going to contain Clown 2, which is one of the more iconic Clown figures. We see him, of course, with the giant gun backpack. In fact, the most recent Clown figure, as I'm recording this video, has an homage to all of this, as he comes with a very similar stupidly huge gun backpack. Although I do like how this version is from the Violator miniseries, as we can see the head that is stuck on his forearm. That's super cool. I like that. That's a nice little artistic touch. We also have Exoskeleton Spawn. I don't remember this figure whatsoever. Apparently this concept of this figure was supposed to be that he wears all of this bone and exo armor as a disguise to fool like different demons that he might encounter. I guess for the playability factor, sure, but to me it's not something that I find all that interesting. What I do find interesting, however, is this awesome Shadowhawk figure who comes with an assortment of gigantic weapons that he was never depicted as using in any of the comics up until this point, but it's fine. It doesn't matter. I get it. It's a playability factor. You're trying to sell these toys to kids at this point, as well as collectors. And we also get the very first action figure of the Max. I do not have any Max figure from the McFarlane toy line, and I would love to get my hands on them. There was a purple Max, and I believe there was also a alternate color variant of the Max where he was like a blue or aquamarine color. And you could also get him with different color Izzes, but that was completely random. You either found him with a black Izz or a white Izz, but they never explained how they packaged them or how many variations there were with the black pack-in Izz or the white pack-in Izz. So you never really knew which of those was the most rare one to find, at least not at the time. There was a lot of rumors about which one was the harder one to find, but again, without McFarlane, actually releasing what numbers those existed in, a lot of it was speculation. But I do recall there being 2 different color variations of the Max, if I remember correctly. Then again, that might just be my mind playing tricks on me, and I'm completely wrong. If I am, leave it in the comments, and I'll gladly admit that I made a mistake. We then, of course, get to 2 pages of Spawn Direct where you could order apparel and toys and comic books and a whole host of other Spawn memorabilia goodies and grab bags and whatnot. And I wish a lot of this stuff still existed. As I've stated before, all of these hats and shirts are super cool, and I'd absolutely still wear this stuff if I could get my hands on it anywhere. I know that you can still get Spawn t-shirts to this day, but these ones in particular, I really like and wish they still existed. And if I ever found someone who was selling them at a comic book convention or happened across one in like a flea market or a thrift store, you better believe I would buy it, assuming it was in my size. But who knows? Even if it wasn't, I might still buy it just because I thought it was cool. On the last page of the issue, we get an advertisement for Wizard number 56, which has an exclusive Chrome card pack-in of an Angela Chrome card, the first in the set. I have a few of these Chrome cards, though I do not have the Angela one, and I wish I did because it would be cool if I had that. It also contains a pack-in of Lady Rawhide 1/2. I'll be the first to admit, I am aware of Lady Rawhide. I know nothing about this character. I've never really come across any of her comic books throughout my time in collecting and digging through dollar bins. Maybe that's just, where I've done this, where I live at. Or it could be the fact that Lady Rawhide just wasn't all that popular of a character, and therefore there's not a lot of issues of this book floating around out there. Either way, if I ever came across it, I'd definitely pick it up. And if I ever came across a set, you better believe I'd buy it, and I'd immediately start making videos about it on this channel. And on the reverse inside cover, we get an advertisement for the Spawn Super Nintendo video game. As I've stated in the past, it's not the greatest game in the world, but it's not terrible either. It is pretty difficult though, so if you've never played it and you decide you're going to emulate it or something like that, just be aware, you're in for a challenge. This game is no walk in the park. And that was Spawn number 41. Overall, I don't have any real, huge complaints about it. It was kind of weird having 3 separate storylines all kind of crammed into one single issue. Even though I don't feel like it was confusing to do so, Todd did do a very good job of making the Spawn story the bookends to the book, while also giving us updates about what's going on with Jason Wynn, along with Cy-Gor. And it all feels like it flows okay. My real complaints come from, like I said, the issues I have with the plot holes in Cy-Gor's backstory, and also the idea of all of these unanswered questions we have about the curse. What are these little cyber goblin guys? Where did they come from? How did Curse create them? What is the whole reasoning behind that? Also, where the hell is this castle at? Where is it built? How was it built? Why was Spawn brought to some medieval, castle that exists on some kind of impossible rock outcropping? I get it. It's supposed to look cool, but it doesn't make any sense. And the fact that we don't get any kind of, dialogue or exposition that addresses any of that only makes it more confusing. But then again, these are just my opinions. You may not have been confused by any of that at all. You might not have a problem with any of Cy-Gor's backstory. And perhaps you don't like the fact that Todd put 3 separate storylines into one book. And if that's the case, it's okay, because everyone's entitled to their own opinions. If you enjoyed today's video, please feel free to like, comment, and subscribe. And thanks for stopping by. Have a great day.